Last week, we left off with one of the great cliffhangers in the Bible. If you stop at the 35th verse of chapter 21, it really feels like there's got to be more. And in fact, I remember when we got to that spot, and I was trying to make my message sort of mimic the tension that you're left with. I basically just said a sentence and ended, and I said, "Stand and sing." And you all look baffled. I love standing here because it's really a fun place to observe human nature from, because everyone was like, wait, could that possibly have been the end of his message? Can that possibly have been the end of Paul's story right there? About to be arrested? The mob gathering, to do away with him? Well, Paul's gone to Jerusalem against the advice of practically everybody. That's what we saw in chapter 21. The Holy Spirit had confirmed to Paul over and over again what was going to happen to him when he got to Jerusalem. Pretty much from the minute that he arrived in the city, Paul became a lightning rod of contention, this foment that was raised against him. It's like the city suddenly goes mad just because Paul has showed up. And there's an ongoing question of whether people born outside of Judaism could be included in the salvation that is in Christ Jesus. That's a part of it. Paul's very presence in the city stirred up such turmoil that a riot ensued. This time the riot wasn't over a Greek god like it happened in Ephesus. Remember when they were yelling at him, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," and they were freaking out because he was threatening the Greek gods. This time the riot goes to the very core of faith in Christ and what it means. And the Jews themselves became so angry with Paul that they began to beat him. And he had to be rescued by the Roman tribune, who was a minor official who was in charge of the Roman guard. The crowd had an intention already back in chapter 21 of beating Paul to death. But let's see what's really going on here, where we really are. Because it's a much more complex story than just that this guy Paul had been stirring up strife and comes into the city again and it causes this reaction. It seems like, where did that come from? Where did that reaction on the part of the crowd come from? It's much more complex than Acts 22 at first reveals. So if you're not already there, you want to open your scriptures to Acts. We're still in chapter 21 at verse 37. We'll start there. There is a reason Paul, rather than any of the other apostles, was such a problem for early Christianity in Jerusalem. There's a reason why Paul himself is the problem. Now, we've all heard about the political parties that existed within Judaism at the time. You probably have heard the names, the Pharisees, and one of the distinctives of the Pharisees was that they believed in resurrection. They were sort of the liberals of the first century Judaism, if you can think of it that way. And then there was the Sadducees, who deny that there's ever a resurrection, that the dead are never raised. And so they've sort of splintered off into factions, theological factions within Judaism. And there's other groups as well. There's the Essenes and the Zealots and groups like that. And together, they formed a representative council that was called the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was a sort of a power within Judaism in the first century in Jerusalem, and had some power to make pronouncements beyond Jerusalem city itself. But something happened At the end of the prophetic era, now I've got to go into the Old Testament a little bit here. The prophetic era ends roughly with the last piece of prophecy that's written, which is around 385 BC. Just about that same time, something happened in their world that hugely influenced Jewish life and practice, and we need to know about it before we can go into this passage that was just read for us by Jane. The something that happened was that Alexander the Great came to power in 336 BC, and he consolidated a distinctively Greek empire, which in its day was as influential and as far-reaching as Rome was by the time that Paul comes around. So in the late 300s BC, 336 down to about 323, I think it is, BC, Alexander the Great is in power, and his empire swung all the way around from the area that is now Rome, all the way around to Egypt, and certainly included Jerusalem, included all of the lands that the Jews traditionally held as theirs. And one of the distinctives of what Alexander did in his time was that he created a world language. We call it Koine Greek. It is a spoken Greek language and a written Greek language that became very popular for a time in that region. Many Jews adopted these Greek ways and learned the Greek language during this period and somewhat beyond, with the result that by the 1st century AD, there were what were called Hellenist Jews, and the Hellenists were Greek-speaking Jews. They did not speak Aramaic, which is spoken Hebrew. All right, so when you talk about Hebrew, Hebrew is the written language. Aramaic is the spoken language. Make that distinction. These Hellenists read and spoke Greek pretty much everywhere, including in the synagogue. So the two major centers of Hellenist Judaism by the 1st century were Alexandria down in Egypt and Antioch up in Syria, on the Syria-Turkey border. And we've been hearing a lot about Antioch, haven't we, through our study of Acts, because that's where Paul had made his home base. So you might say that the Hellenists had Jerusalem surrounded. Antioch is about 80 miles north of Jerusalem, and Alexandria is not much further south of Jerusalem, over in Egypt. So they kind of sandwiched it. So the Hellenist centers where the Jews who lived there were speaking Greek were Antioch and Alexandria. You can remember that because they both start with A. Hellenist Judaism was so popular in the years leading up to Jesus' birth that they even translated the Old Testament into Koine Greek. And it's a collection which came to be known by later scholars as the Septuagint. You may have heard of that at some point. The Septuagint was the Old Testament writings plus some other Jewish writings added in Koine Greek. So you know that they were using this Greek version of the Old Testament in their synagogue teaching. And the whole movement was a powerful force pulling at the foundations of the unity of Judaism itself. And this was not a doctrinal dispute. It had nothing to do with what they taught. It had everything to do with the style and the language in which they taught it. So this was a cultural dispute. So when we meet Paul and we begin to talk about the spread of Christian teaching in the 1st century and why it was so contentious, this is the reason. The whole idea that the teaching of Christ should reach beyond Hebrew roots was very problematic to the Judaizers of Paul's day. And the Judaizers were centered in Jerusalem. They spoke Aramaic, they wrote in Hebrew, and they studied the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew. They saw the new faith moving very quickly north and west toward Athens, and they did not like it. They saw the chief missionary of the faith as a Hellenist who came from Antioch, one of the two centers of Hellenistic Greek Judaism. They saw and perhaps read Paul's letters, and Paul's letters were written in the Greek language, in Koine Greek. They were not written in Hebrew. Paul didn't write anything that he wrote, that we've got a copy of anyway, in Hebrew. There's even some question as to whether a couple of the Gospels were actually originally written in Greek and were translated into Hebrew. So you see what this division was pulling at here. So in short, I think Paul represented a threat to Hebrew Judaism, and I'm sure that many observers of the time imagined that if things continued the way they were going, Paul and his bunch would obliterate historic Judaism within a century or less. I think that's what these folks thought. And here Paul comes into Jerusalem, the very symbol of this Hellenistic, Greek-oriented Judaism that they didn't like. And so, of course, it stirred something up. So the whole thing represents one of the major issues facing the earliest Christians as well. Because remember, the earliest Christians all came out of a Jewish context. For the first 15 years or so, after the resurrection, after the ascension, or in other words, until about the time that Paul shows up on the scene as a converted Jew, one who has embraced Christ and begins to spread the message of Christ, until that point, almost exclusively, the gospel has gone to Jews in Israel. So this whole thing makes Luke's report of Jesus' final words to his disciples just before the ascension really troubling to Judaizers. And there's a way in which you could consider that the entirety of the book of Acts exists to refute the idea that Hellenism is going to take over and obliterate Judaism, or on the other side, that Judaism is going to take over the Hellenistic thing. And so we have to understand that the whole of the book is basically an apology for that. But Acts 1:8, Jesus said, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses," here's the balance, "in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." And if you look at that on a map, which I didn't provide for you today, if you look at it on a map, you start with Jerusalem and you go up into Judea, and then you go beyond up into Samaria, and Samaria borders on Syria, and then you move out into the ends of the earth, and to the ends of the earth to them was Athens. And so, as Jesus says these words at the end of his mission on earth, he's saying, this is not just a Jewish thing. I didn't just come to the Jews. I came to spread the message of reconciliation with God through the incarnate Christ out north and west, south and west, east, in all directions. This isn't going to be a Greek thing. This isn't going to be a Jewish thing. This is going to be a world thing. So if this is going to become something that the world is going to embrace, now the last paragraph of Acts 21 begins to come into focus. And why they did what they did, and why they were so angry the way they were, comes into focus for us. Because this is going absolutely against everything that they had in mind. At verse 37 of chapter 21, that's where you are if you have your Bibles open. At verse 37, Paul has been detained by the tribune. Now, a tribune was an elected Roman military official. He's not a soldier. He's not part of the military. He's an elected person. And the tribune was trying to figure out who Paul is and what this riot was all about. Now, remember, the tribune is not a Jew. He's not a Christian. He's certainly not a Christian. And he is truly the representative of a foreign occupying power in Jerusalem. My gosh, he's more hated in some ways than Paul. The only difference is that he's got an army with him, and Paul doesn't. Paul's just this short, stubby guy with a long hook nose, who really doesn't look very well, and frankly, he's not much of a preacher. We established all of that. Paul doesn't look like much of a danger to anybody, but he seemed to be a danger to everybody. So the tribune has him arrested, and it's so noisy out in the streets that he finally has him brought into the barracks, which is where the tribune's headquarters was. And they get to a place where it's quiet enough that you could be heard over the din of these people yelling for Paul's death. And Paul asks the tribune, he says, "May I say something to you?" He's asking permission. "May I say something to you? Can I speak?" And he said, this is the tribune. The tribune said, "Do you know Greek?" Here it comes. The tribune is trying to figure out why the Judaizers were beating Paul. He thinks he's just found it because Paul spoke to him in Greek. See? Paul said, "May I say something to you?" And those words he said in Greek. And the tribune goes, he didn't have glasses on like I do, but "You know Greek?" And the tribune jumps to a conclusion. Paul has addressed the tribune in the common language that they could both speak. And the tribune says to himself, "This man is a Hellenist, and that's what this riot's all about. Oh, I get it." So the tribune takes a stab at what the cause of the riot is and says, "You must be the Egyptian, the one who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the Assyrians out into the wilderness, right? You're that guy." In other words, you're a Hellenist from Alexandria, Egypt, right? No. Paul stops the tribune right there, and he consequently stops the rioters dead in their tracks too. He says, "No, I'm a Jew. Yes, I'm a Jew. That is, I'm a Hebrew speaker." He's not saying it in Greek anymore. He says, "I'm a Jew. I'm a Hebrew speaker. But I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia, up north. And guess what? I'm a citizen," he says, "of no small town." The minute he uses the word citizen, the tribune knows he's in trouble. Because citizen to them is like a free pass. Citizen meant you're a citizen of the empire, the Roman Empire. And he says, "I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." Well, the tribune says to himself, "Well, okay, as citizen, okay, so citizen Paul, go ahead and speak to the people." And that's when Paul motions for silence and opens his mouth. This Greek-speaking, Greek-writing, world-traveling man from Antioch, see, that's what we've all established. We've established that's who he is. This Greek-speaking, Greek-writing, world-traveling man from Antioch addresses the crowd in Hebrew. It's marvelous. That's what stunned the crowd into silence. That's why they stopped yelling. That's why they were willing to listen to him. He was speaking to them in Hebrew. He's saying, "I'm a Judaizer. I'm one of you." That's what happened that day. But let's look beyond the facts of the incident, and you'll see some of Paul's method, why he did what he did. When Paul got to Jerusalem, Paul discovered a context. The second thing he did was that Paul told them how Jesus came to him. The third thing Paul did was that he made his confession. And the fourth thing he did was he abandoned the outcome. He discovered a context, he told them how Jesus came to him, he made his confession, and he abandoned the outcome. Let's look at each of those. First, he discovered a context. We've already talked a good deal about the background of the Hellenist Judaist split within first century Judaism and then within the early church. But we really cannot stress enough how Paul establishes that he understands the context that he's walking into. He understands who he's speaking to. He understands what their background is. In both cases, see, because there's two things he does here. He talks first to the tribune. He understands who the tribune is. He understands that the tribune is a Roman official who speaks Greek. And so Paul establishes himself as a world person. I'm from Cilicia. I'm a Greek speaker. Paul establishes that he's a citizen of Rome, which you actually don't find out for sure until verse 39 of chapter 22. Or 21, sorry. And then he establishes also that Paul is from a Hellenist background. You can say that. Paul is from a Hellenist background. He grew up in Antioch, and he comes from up there. But he's going to fill in some more blanks for the crowd. But he leaves it there. I'm from a Hellenist background. So he establishes rapport with this tribune, with this minor Roman official, and that's how he earns himself the right to speak. Because he's having a conversation with the guy. After the tribune gives Paul permission to talk, then he establishes rapport with the mob, with the Jews. So here's this mob in front of him. He's on the steps he's found himself an elevated place to go and stand on. He's a few steps up, whatever that means. And to the mob, he speaks in Hebrew. Flawless Hebrew. Paul is a Jew, he says. Not just any Jew, not a Hellenist Jew. I'm going to speak to you in Hebrew. I am one of you. In Philippians chapter 3, probably my favorite book of the entire New Testament. And in Philippians 3, Paul says, if any other man thinks that he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, in other words, a Jew born and raised on Jewish teaching in the Hebrew and Aramaic language. A Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness, under the law blameless. Paul's given his credentials, and they are magnificent, impeccable credentials for the first century. But Paul is establishing to this mob here in Jerusalem on this particular day, he's establishing to this mob that he is not a Hellenist. He is speaking to them in Hebrew. He was brought up in Jerusalem, he says. He studied at the feet of the great Rabbi Gamaliel. Which means nothing to you and me, but it meant a lot to them because Gamaliel, to say you studied under Gamaliel was kind of like saying that you had been a student of, a major Yale professor, right? And everyone knows the major Yale professor's name. It's your calling card. I studied under Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was a member of the Jewish ruling council, so everyone knew who he was. Paul also establishes that he's not a Judaizer either. I'm not a Hellenist. I'm also not a Judaizer. He was a persecutor of the way. He was responsible for tracking down early Christians in a Greek context outside of Jerusalem and putting them to death. He did that as a representative of Rome, and so they can be assured that he is also not a Judaizer. So Paul established first that the context for them, he established a rapport with them and said, yes, I am of you. I speak as you do. I speak the Hebrew language. I know who you are. I know what you're like. And then he goes beyond their context and he establishes a new context while not underestimating the power of the old context. Paul established a context. Second, Paul told them how Jesus came to him. It's in chapter 22, verses 6 through 16. We've all heard this before. It's almost verbatim from the story back in the 9th chapter of Acts of Paul's conversion. But let's go through it very quickly. What are the elements of it? First, there's a stimulus. The stimulus is a blinding light and a voice from heaven. Paul wasn't, what the church called in the 90s a seeker. Paul wasn't seeking Jesus. He was seeking Christians to put them to death. The stimulus for what's going to happen to Paul was this blinding light and a voice from heaven. Second, the question. There's a question that every person who comes to Christ always asks. Who are you, Lord? Who are you? After the stimulus has been brought upon you and you find yourself in a Christian context, the very first thing you're going to say, and you come face to face with God in some way, is, who are you, Lord? Third, the next question, the question after the question. What do you want me to do, God? Those are the two questions that everybody who ever became a Christian always has to ask. Who are you? And once you establish who he is, then you have to ask the question, what do you want me to do? And that leads to Paul's conversion. Stimulus, question, conversion. Ananias says to Paul, Brother Saul, receive your sight. To see it all, spiritually speaking, to see it all is to see truly. You'll be blind, groping around in the dark, looking at whatever you think you're looking at, but it's darkness, until those two questions result in your conversion and you begin to see. And then finally, baptism. Symbolically washing away sins. To believe is to confess. Romans 10, Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Baptism is public confession of Christ. So, stimulus, question, conversion, baptism. That's what that story tells us. That's what happened to Paul. That's what he now wants to communicate to this mob. That's what happened to me. He's telling his own story. He is not establishing with this mob any doctrinal question. He's not making sure they understand that Christ came to the earth by prophecy. He's not establishing the virgin birth. He's not establishing the incarnation. He's not establishing the works of Jesus. He's not establishing the timeline of the ministry of Jesus. He's not establishing the way that Jesus was arrested on the week before the Passover. He's not establishing that Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. He's not establishing that Jesus rose from the dead. He's not establishing that Jesus rose into heaven. He is not establishing any of those things. What he's establishing is God came to me in the person of Jesus Christ, and this is my story. That's all that he tells them. The third thing he does is he makes his confession. I can't even begin to underscore how important this is to Christian faith. First, he makes his confession to God. That's back in in the initial story. How do you? He tells God how he opposed God in his life. In verse 19 here, as you're reading it in chapter 22, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. But watch this. As Paul tells his story to the mob, he is now relating his confession to them. He is telling people how he opposed God. He's not just telling God how he opposed him. He's telling people how he opposed him. It is important that those of you who proclaim Christ understand that you were not always friends of Jesus. You were not always his servants. You were not always here as a display of his splendor, all those things. That wasn't always you. Your story has to begin, as Paul's does, with you opposing God, even as a small child. I found it, Jamie and I were taking care of our 3 grandsons for the last week. So if I look a little bedraggled, that's what the reason is. There's 6, 4, and 3. And they were wonderful. We had a great time. But I can tell you that a 3-year-old is perfectly capable of opposing almost anything. And I love them all dearly. I wouldn't trade the week I had for anything. So it's important that every life that finds Christ, or that Christ finds, I guess I should say, every one of us understands and is willing to tell others how we have opposed God. And if you find yourself as a Christian, if you find yourself in a place, some point in your life, and you wake up one day and you say, wow, I've been opposing Jesus on this. It's not just important that you tell God that you opposed him. It's important that you tell the body. Bring it to your brothers and sisters. It takes an awful lot more courage, for some strange reason, to bring how you have sinned toward God, how you've opposed God, to bring that to a group of believers like this, people you know really well. It takes a lot more courage to do that than it does, for some strange reason, to bring that to the God of the universe. You guys don't have, there's nothing you can do to harm me. I mean, unless you want to form a riot and try to do with Paul. There's nothing you can do to harm me. You don't have my life in your hands. God does. Why wouldn't I be more afraid to tell him how I've opposed him than I would be to tell you? But it's important that you do it. And if you find, and if you're sitting there today and you find that in your life there's a way in which you've significantly opposed God, and it's time to abandon that, to let go of that, then these are the people that you need to tell that to after you make your peace with God. Finally, the fourth thing that Paul does here is he abandons the outcome, not the outcome of his spiritual life, but the outcome of his physical life. When you become a witness for Christ, when you speak his name publicly, whether that's to a coworker or your boss, or to a friend while you're having lunch, or wherever you happen to be, when you do that, you must not assume that you're going to have a particular outcome from that conversation. When I was a young Christian, I would go into discussions where I knew I was going to be sharing the gospel with somebody, and in my head I'd be saying, I'm going to sit with this person until they receive Christ. How to not make friends and influence people. So you have to abandon the outcome. You will likely meet opposition from some of them at first. Often The opposition will come from the very people who have the greatest background in Christianity. I did that when people were witnessing to me. I'd grown up in church. My mother was a church secretary. Our family founded the church that I had been part of I don't know what it is, over 300 years ago. I had a huge background in Christianity. And when somebody spoke the truth about Jesus to me, you know what I did? I opposed it. I said, that's not what I heard in church. And so the Jews cried all the more. The Jews, his own countrymen, cried all the more for his death. And Paul said to me, go, I'm going to send you far away to the Gentiles, because the Jews in Jerusalem won't listen to you. Do you have any idea how painful that must have been for Paul? These are your own people in your own place where the temple is, and they won't listen. They won't hear that Jesus met you on the road to Damascus. They won't believe you. They won't trust the word of God's own grace. Instead, they're going to try and cast you out. They're going to try and stone you. They're going to try and obliterate you from the earth. Your own people. And you'll also, if you become a witness, you'll also likely meet compassion sometimes, often from strange places you didn't expect to have compassion toward your message. Well, they may not become Christians right off, but the Tribune ultimately released Paul. He's a citizen of Rome. I don't care what his message is. He's a citizen of Rome. We got to let him go. You'll often find that compassion will come from some of the strangest places. It won't come from in the church. I mean, you hope it would, but it often won't. Not when you're out as a witness. So then I have one more thing I want to tell you. Paul went to Jerusalem. He discovered a context. He told them how Jesus came to him. He made his confession, and he abandoned the outcome. When you go to Jerusalem, it's right out the door here. When you go to Jerusalem, it's your hometown. It's where you're from. It's where you've grown up. It's where you've been raised. You know the teachers that taught you. You know the places. You know the way to all the different landmarks in town. It's your Jerusalem. When you go to Jerusalem, discover their context. Speak to them in the language they are using today. Talk to them the way that they're talking today, not the way that you were traditionally taught. Learn the language, because there's a whole new generation out there, and they're speaking a different language. And in a lot of cases, they're not even speaking it, they're tweeting it. And you have to learn the shorthands, TXT. Where's the E? I don't understand. Why can't you use the E? Because a tweet only allows how many characters? What is it?
31, I think.
So you see, you all know there's an argument arose about how many characters there are. Discover the context, folks. And you're never too old to do that. You're never too young to discover the context. If you're young and God sends you to a place where the context is, sends you into a context where everybody is of a certain class or of a certain age, discover their context. Who are they? Why are you here? And what are you going to say to them that will be meaningful for the gospel? Second, tell them how Jesus came to you. You don't need to have 5 Bible verses memorized, although most of you actually probably do have 5 verses memorized. You just don't know it. discover the context, tell them how Jesus came to you. Because he did. If you're a Christian, Jesus came to you. You didn't go to him. He came to you. Finally, third, rather, make your confession. It's not just even your brothers and sisters in the church that you need to tell how you oppose God to. It's a significant part of your message. I did this. I turned away from God. I was like this. And Jesus came to me. So no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter how bad you've been, Jesus wants you. That's what you're establishing when you confess publicly. And finally, abandon the outcome. You don't know. You don't know whether you're just planting a seed or whether you just happen to have stumbled into the right moment and somebody's going to become a Christian. But that's what we can learn from Paul and from this moment, this cliffhanger moment that we left you with last weekend that we've just explored. We can learn how to be witnesses using his method, which, by the way, I challenge you, go back and read the gospel we read this morning again. Is it John 19? You'll find that it was actually Jesus' method too. Go through the story of Zacchaeus and you'll see the same method being applied. Discover a context. Tell them how Jesus came to you. Make your confession. And then abandon the outcome. And Jesus calls Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus does all of those things, even in that very moment. All right. Well, that's where we'll drop off for today. And we're on in the very final segment of Acts these next few weeks. Look for things to get really, really bad for poor Paul. Stand.